skeptics of the Democrats would say, well, the mainline Democrats many also receive real estate money and charter school money. So is it the IDC that's holding up this legislation? And if the mainline Democrats had control of the Democratic Party, would they really be passing sweeping progressive legislation as they claim?
Those are really good questions. I think we know that the state assembly is really dominated by New York City Democrats. The state assembly has very much been aligned with labor unions, especially the teachers union and others. Not a lot of real estate money going to assembly Democrats. The Senate is not necessarily the same ballgame as you're indicating, so we don't know. And we don't know what a Democratic Senate majority would do exactly. I think we do know that the results of the legislation moving through the state legislature would be further to the left if Democrats control both chambers. I don't really see there's any way to argue against that. The degree is, we don't know to what degree. We don't know to what degree state Senate Democrats would go along with trying to push tougher rent regulations, for example, right? Which is something that real estate often fights against, affordable housing requirements and things like that, and education reform, as you mentioned. Of course, Governor Cuomo continues to be a key player on that front, and he's moved all over the place on education issues, and now he's sort of all the way, not all the way to the left, but back towards the left on that equation. So a lot of moving parts. We don't know what a Senate Democratic majority would do, but I think we can safely say that it would be further left than what the state is getting now. And one of the fascinating dynamics of all this, which is again where Governor Cuomo comes in about what does he prefer here, is if you had Democrats controlling the Assembly and the Senate and pushing bills onto the governor's desk that were a little further left than he wanted to go in certain circumstances, and again, that I'm not talking about social policy here, I might be talking about spending, that could force the governor to be a lot more sort of seeming centrist than he really wants to seem. He'd rather sort of be in this position where it seems like he's actually pushing progressive stuff through a GOP-controlled chamber, which he actually has done some of with marriage equality and gun control and the minimum wage.
It's almost actually reverse triangulation. People say that he triangulates, but if you think of how Bill Clinton triangulated, it was to appear to be more moderate and run in a moderate era.
Right.
Whereas now we have this progressive populist era, and of course New York State is an incredibly democratic state in registration numbers. This all begs a question, over his presidential aspirations. When you look at the legislation that could be passed if the Democrats were a majority and actually pushed for this type of legislation, it's not just the social issues and the economic issues, but there are some real reform issues here in New York that need to be addressed. And as you mentioned, there's been countless indictments for many elected officials who've got to leave office. The leaders of the Senate and the Assembly have both been indicted and convicted. Corruption is a problem. You have voting issues. That's a problem. There's this thing called the LLC loophole, which I would love to discuss.
Sure.
Ethics reform is never on the table, but it's always campaigned on. Some would say that Governor Cuomo doesn't want the Democrats to have the majority because by not passing these things, he can control the mechanisms of politics in the state more, especially as he plans to run for president.
Right. I mean, Cuomo's facing re-election for a third term in 2018, which seems like he intends to run for and is a heavy favorite, in part because of the huge war chest that he has, which is in part due to the LLC loophole, which basically allows companies to create LLCs, limited liability corporations, under whatever names and give as much as they want virtually to candidates. The governor has something like $20 million in the bank already, and he's barely even started fundraising for his third-term race. And then, assuming he wins that, he may very well look at 2019 into 2020 looking at president. At this juncture, I don't have a window into Cuomo's psyche, of course, but at this juncture, the rap on him and on New York as this cesspool of government corruption, I think is more disadvantageous for him than anything he might lose by actually getting these reforms through. So I think he would like to see more reforms go through. I just think that the appetite is not really there in the legislature. The governor doesn't really want to go out there barnstorming and talking about these issues all over the state, even though, we've been reporting about how quiet he's been on ethics reform after outlining a 10-point plan in his State of the State. Because if he goes around the state like he did on minimum wage, for example, and is talking about we need government ethics reform, we need electoral reform, we need campaign finance reform, he has to talk about all the problems in a way that makes his house look very out of order.
So let's discuss that.
Sure. I mean,
it's not a secret, but no one seems to talk about it. Governor Cuomo, when he first ran on reform in government against corruption. And then he set up this thing called the Moreland Commission, which Preet Bharara, of course, the former U.S. attorney, was looking into. And as soon as the Moreland Commission started to pry into the governor's affairs, this has been reported, the governor decided, I'm going to shut down this Moreland Commission looking into public corruption because now they're looking at my house.
Right.
And Preet Bharara, of course, was investigating.
Well, Preet Bharara sort of investigated once he shut it down
Right.
because it looked like there was that undue decision making there, that you set up this corruption commission, then you shut it down because it's looking at some of the folks in your orbit. Didn't look good. Bharara wound up clearing the governor, but it was, again, one of those clearances that is, we don't have enough evidence to charge a federal crime. That's not a clean bill of health by any means, right? And so we've seen that from Bharara's office and others, around political ethics issues that are not necessarily rising to the level of criminality. The governor's approach, has always been, well, I'm moving the ball down the field, because what he was able to say with Moreland is, with the legislature, I shut down this commission, but I got a few new measures of ethics, more disclosure of finances. Legislators can make all this outside income, things like that. And of course, every year there's these incremental steps that most people look at and say it's not nearly enough. And that's why they keep having to come back, and he keeps outlining new measures. And then people say, well, but didn't you just pass another set of bills that you said was going to clean up Albany, and then it didn't? So this is an annual thing for the governor. He came out with a pretty big, bold agenda in January, but then, like I said, hasn't followed it up with a peep since. And the legislature, there's not a big appetite. The Assembly Democrats probably would go along with some of these measures, limits on outside income, but there's limited appetite there, and then there's certainly not appetite in the Senate GOP, in part because they're hanging on to this bare majority. They absolutely don't want campaign finance reform because they rely on major donations through the LLC loophole. And of course, they equate that with Democrats fundraising from labor unions, which is a topic for another time. But those types of campaign finance reforms, the governor has talked about public campaign financing, a system maybe similar to what New York City has, which is sort of heralded as a model. It's gone nowhere. There isn't a huge groundswell around it because the governor's focused on his economic development projects and his big infrastructure projects, and he doesn't seem to have a lot of appetite for really taking that on.
But just to tie back to Preet Bharara's investigation, there were people in his office that were implicated, high up.
Oh, sure. So separate from Moreland, recently we had these big indictments come down of people in the governor's orbit, a very close former aide who he said was like a brother, Joe Percoco, a former lobbyist / aide to the governor, Todd Howe, and then major donors to the governor, these development businesses that were major donors to the governor, getting contracts through the governor's economic development programs. There was bid rigging. There's alleged bid rigging. We're going to see this go to trial, we think, in either late this year or early 2018, which, going back to the governor's reelection, could throw a whole new monkey wrench into that if there's a trial going on that relates to his closest inner circle as well as his major economic development programs.
Meaning the Buffalo Billion.
The Buffalo Billion, and then other projects in Syracuse and around the state, but largely the Buffalo Billion.
And Preet Bharara has not been quiet since he's left. Some of his first comments were, what was his first tweet? Something.
Well,
he always put it up. But.
Yeah. One of the things that he did actually, which set off a firestorm, is he retweeted my tweet of our article about how Cuomo was silent since the State of the State on ethics reform, and so that was maybe his fourth or fifth tweet since he created his personal account. So that sort of set people's hair on fire a little bit about the fact that he would take note of that article and send it out to his many thousands of followers. And then right at midnight on April 1st, he tweeted, breaking news, state government passes sweeping ethics reform, #April Fools. So he's sort of been trolling a bit. There were one or two others as well. So Bharara is absolutely not being quiet as a private citizen, and I think he really saw up close the problems in Albany and the fact that the governor and others haven't had a big appetite in trying to fix them. And one more thing I'll say on that Bharara gets at, as well as reform-minded good government groups or legislators, it's not about setting up things for punishment. One of the biggest, most recent pushes is about stripping pensions from corrupt legislators. Nobody disagrees with that. Nobody thinks that Shelley Silver going away to jail for public corruption should collect a pension, even though he will, because this hasn't been passed.
The former speaker.
This former Speaker of the Assembly. Or Dean Skelos, the former Senate Majority Leader, who's also going to jail. They're going to collect pensions. They are collecting pensions. But that's been one of the measures that is advancing, is stripping pensions from corrupt elected officials. Nobody disagrees with that. But what people, including Preet Bharara, have talked about quite a bit is, what are you doing on the front end to prevent corruption, to set up a system where there isn't all this temptation for pay to play, which goes to campaign finance? Mm-hmm. Are you limiting outside income, where then people aren't worried about where they're getting other money from? You maybe raise the salary of legislators, but you make the position full-time. Mm-hmm. Those types of preventative measures are just almost non-existent. Cuomo outlined some of them, but they're not going anywhere right
now. The appetite around the country right now is frustration with elected officials, government, the status quo, and locally you've seen a lot of these IDC members have protests. No one seemed to care about this for 8 years, mm-hmm. and now people are paying attention. They're showing up to town halls. They're staging protests outside of these offices, hundreds of people. Do you think it's going to make a difference in 2018?
Yes. Right now, I would say yes. There's a different energy. I mean, you saw it. If you're on the Democratic side of things, you're sort of shaking your head and saying, like, where was this energy leading up to the presidential election? But you've seen this, amazing new life to engagement. January 21st, the women's marches all across the country, and then other smaller scale signs. The protests of the IDC members absolutely is another of these signs. Now, my question would be, does this sustain itself to those elections? But as of right now, you see these signs, and I think there's a lot of people who are saying, this is not what we elected you to do, this is not how we want you to be representing us. So I think the IDC might have some strong questions to answer in 2018. However, in 2014, as I said before, there were a couple of IDC members, including the leader, Jeff Klein, where mainline Democrats at least got people to challenge them, and then they backed away. In 2016, they were not challenged. Right. Jeff Klein did not face a challenger, right? The mainline Democrats did not try to put some up against Tony Avella again, or any of the members. So that's one of the questions for 2018. You could have all these protests, but is there organization around finding a candidate? Somewhat like the Democrats on the far left did with Zephyr Teachout, but again, the infrastructure was pulled out from under her when the WFP went with Cuomo in a brokered deal, which again, probably something they would not do again in 2018, perhaps, So I think that's one thing that the IDC is very cognizant of, and is looking at Raise the Age, for example, as one of these things to say, this will absolutely protect us from challenges from the left, perhaps.
Except all these criminal justice groups have come down hard on them. Ben Max, thank you so much. Great comprehensive overview of the state of the IDC and New York politics.
My pleasure.